After a canceled congressional meeting with Democratic leaders, a government shutdown is now looking more and more likely.
WIFR reporter Mike Walsh talked to two Illinois congressmen and got their feelings on the potential stoppage.
So if Congress is shut down, there is no federal oversight for anything.
The threat of a government shutdown looms after President Donald Trump canceled a congressional meeting with Democratic leaders.
Well, what if Donald Trump uses his signature and closes it all down? That's going to have a real impact, a terrible impact on the people we serve here in Rockford.
With threats of job loss and deferred payments, Congressman Eric Sorensen said this shutdown could take away some crucial positions.
We need TSA to be able to get paid. I want to make sure that the air traffic controllers get paid to keep the skies over Rockford. I want to make sure that law enforcement gets paid, that the FBI that is doing the work to solve crimes in the city of Rockford gets paid.
And it isn't just the Democrats that would like to avoid a closure of the government.
Deficiencies and the damage that will be done by a government shutdown, we can't allow that to happen. We're elected officials. We have to work together to find a resolution.
While the two sides may agree they need to work together, it seems a resolution is still a long ways away.
Chuck Schumer in the Senate needs to do that also. It is a clean continuing resolution. He has the ability to pass this, put politics aside, put the country ahead of everything else. That's what we should do. This will be the Schumer shutdown if it happens.
In Rockford, Mike Walsh, WIFR News.
House Speaker Mike Johnson says there are no plans for the House to return before the October 1st deadline. Nothing changes by then. A shutdown is almost certain.